Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's welcome David from X-Force Red to give you the 1:30 talk.
Hi, folks. How's everybody doing today? Excellent, excellent, good. So hopefully you're at the right talk. Goldilocks and the 3 ATMs. There's a talk about breaking into ATM machines, a little bit about some of the controls that are missing and some of the things that I'm seeing, and how one company lost $7 million US, or 131 million Mexican pesos. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. David Bryan. I'm an opper for ThoughtCon, which is a Chicago-based hacking conference. It's pretty fun. It's happening pretty soon. I think our tickets are already sold out, but keep us in mind next time. I've also been involved with DEF CON for 20 years now. Started out doing physical security gooning, moved into network, was into network for quite a while, and now I actually run the department that streams DC TV to everybody's hotel room. So if you ever get to sit and watch the hotel rooms or the talks in your hotel room, you can thank the team that I'm working with. Also, Tour Camp is a really great thing that happens every other year. I'm really proud of it. I'm a participant there. I think it's really important to be part of the community. And if you haven't, participate in your local DEF CON groups. DC 612 was one that I started 10 years ago and has been going strong ever since. It's a really good way to meet other people in your community. It's a good way to network, find jobs, find out about threats, etc. I also really am frustrated with how a lot of the internet service providers are treating privacy and net neutrality, right? They're kind of going out the window. So I started a wireless ISP in Minnesota because I wanted to have some option for people in my neighborhood to have better internet. I also work for a company called IBM. They've been around for a while. However, X-Force Red is a new group inside of IBM. We've only been around for 3 years. It's basically a pen testing group. It's pretty fun. Pretty crazy stuff that we see. So this talk, if you guys want, there's some seats down up front here, and I think I see a few kind of in between up in the 3rd and 4th row. So in this case, when I submitted this talk, it was 3. As of 2 weeks ago, it's now 4. I'm going to give each of the ATMs a designation of ATM Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. Pretty much so that they're anonymous instead of being named out. I don't want to call out any of the vendors. I'm not going to read the slide there, but essentially it was interesting. We had some ATMs that had very strong security. They actually locked the stuff down. And we had some ATMs that assumed that the security software that was installed was actually going to prevent a lot of the attacks that we ran. And that's not the case. And then the last couple talk about some physical, some electronic, but much more physical controls, right? Some of the flaws we found in one of the ATMs with 2 UDP packets, we're actually able to compromise the system. In ATM Bravo, because they hadn't patched the system, right? It was vulnerable to Eternal Blue, which is almost 2 years out of date for patches. That's insane to have a Windows machine that is that far out of date. ATM Charlie, as we will call it, had some really poor physical security around the computer compartment, right? They did have a little bit of a problem with their full disk encryption, and thus they had millions in cash stolen. So ATMA, this was actually an ATM that they had gone through and they had hardened the OS. There was, I think, all but 2 services listening on the machine. They had actually disabled SMB and anything that an attacker could potentially leverage. It was quite a feat. And the ATM software itself was not running as a privileged user. It was an unprivileged user that the ATM software was running on, which is uncommon. Most of the times when we see these devices that are doing kiosks or some sort of function like this, the software that's actually dispensing the cash is running as admin, which is unfortunate. It didn't use full disk encryption, right? And so that's a big risk to me, right? From the perspective that these could be anywhere. You don't know what your attack scenario is going to be. If they gain access to the hard drive, you know, they're now going to be able to clone and write to the data to the disk or whatever. We're also able to boot from our own operating system, so we could throw a Kali boot in it, boot it up, dump the SMB password, pull it out, and move on. And we had ATM Bravo. This ATM was definitely super easy to compromise, right? Without having to open the box or even gain access to anything physical, we could plug into the network and basically run eternal blue attacks against this machine and compromise it. It was pretty bad. The other thing is the ATM software was running as administrator, right? So there was no separation of privileges. If I had gotten access to the maintenance window or maintenance computer, or screen, I should say, screen or display. There's essentially a maintenance display that flips out. You can plug a USB drive in. It's game over, right? There's no separation of duties or separation of privileges. We're able to pull the drive out, obviously, and mount it. Again, not using full disk encryption. It was really bad. ATM Charlie was actually a lot better. In this case, they had gone through and hardened the system. They had antivirus software actually deployed on this system. They had something called GVM Checker, which is a company that's put out this software specifically for ATMs to lock down ATMs, right? They do full disk encryption for them. They'll lock out USB HIDs, and this is a pre-boot control, right? So pre-boot means that before Windows actually starts booting, it loads a little tiny Linux kernel that then locks down the USB devices and then loads Windows. I was actually quite impressed with it because we couldn't mount the drive to start out with, couldn't boot from our own OS. All the network traffic was encrypted. But they had this problem, this pretty big problem, where they had lost a ton of money. And in fact, we went out on site to one of the grocery stores where their ATMs were deployed. And basically, I'd identified an issue, and I'll show you the issue in a little bit here. But, they had all of these ATMs sitting empty with no cash in them, right? Because they had a risk, a huge risk that had already, they'd hit over 100 ATMs at this point. All right, so ATMA, right, ATM Alpha, this is the one they said was hardened. We're able to boot it into Kali, dumped the SAM files. We also found the admin password in log files, right? This is like Security 101, stop writing passwords to log files, stop writing passwords to log files, stop writing passwords to log files. We also pulled a binary. The binary was a custom written application specifically for this ATM, and it was a management app that the company who created the ATM made so that they could deploy patches, so they could do maintenance, all sorts of stuff. We pulled the binary off of it and we started reversing it. And we were on site for 2 weeks, right? You know, in this case, this was an ATM in Japan. So, you know, it was a good time, but you know, you're away from your family for 2 weeks. It gets to be a little long. Anyway, in this case, my coworker John Hoops started going through, used IDA Pro to sort of watch the memory and watch how stuff was flowing. He's like, I think there's a problem here. So he pulls up a decompiler, goes through and figures out that there's a certain offset that the software looks for, a byte offset in a packet. And if you just bypass that at some point, it just runs the command. So, you know, we only had 1,500 or 1,400 bytes to be able to send a payload to this machine. So thus why we have 2 packets. The first packet is, hey, go download this. The second packet is, hey, run what I just downloaded. It's pretty bad. So in this case, even though we've hardened this system, there was some pretty immense flaws in the management software that obviously hadn't been reviewed. I talked about all this stuff. Well, okay, so the other component is the front end was a Flash app, right? It's a Flash app that runs inside the ATM. And then there's a Java web application that this Flash app would actually post to. And that's the thing that would, the Java app is the thing that would actually dispense cash. Thankfully, they had left behind the debugger tool. So we could pull up the debugger tool and just trap the time where it says, hey, dispense this cache, or vice versa. Hey, I've given you this cache. Like, let's say I put in a certain denomination of bills. I can now just multiply that and post it to their back-end servers. So now all of a sudden, instead of having $1 million in my bank account or $1,000, right, I could have 10,000 or 100,000, right, just by changing that multiplier. An example Java debugger is this, right? Basically be able to go through the code, set a breakpoint. When you're at that breakpoint, come up and prompt me for an input. We found all sorts of other issues with this particular ATM. Logs weren't being encrypted. Logs were trusting the time on the ATM, right? I mean, there's all sorts of like inconsistencies with how these systems are set up. It's pretty bad. I think their only saving grace for ATM Alpha and Bravo was that they were using what's called a bylock, right? It uses sidebar technology to prevent picking. It's fairly pick resistant, you know. I could probably spend a couple hours trying to pick open this lock, and I may not get it. That said, like I said, we were on site for 2 weeks for this one engagement. We got a little bored. And that week that we were on site, our president was on national news with this segment. And we decided that we've compromised this ATM. We should probably put this up on the screen. So we replaced the Flash video archive that showed, please take your cache, with one of our own videos. Basically, that's what was going on there. That is from the actual ATM. It was pretty fun. All right, so let's go back to ATM-C, right? Talked about, it's got basically everything that we want, right? System is hardened, antivirus. It's got this like control software that actually goes through and locks down the ATM, locks down the USB HIDs. How could they have stolen $7 million from this machine, right? Does anybody know what type of lock this is? I see one hand. Is anybody awake? Okay, good. So this is a wafer lock. And this is the lock that was used to protect the computer compartment of ATM Charlie, right? This is insane. It takes seconds to open this lock, right? The other problem is this GVM checker software allows the user to say, just use the hardware to generate the hard drive, the full disk encryption key. Does anybody see a problem with that? So, what we think happened, they had a pop-up event, like a tent event, and this company that we did the work for brought these ATMs on site. At the end of the event, tents were torn down, loaded on the truck, ATMs were loaded on the truck, and the truck was stolen. So what I'm assuming is that these criminals are actually taking these drives and running to the ATMs that they had stolen, putting the drives in, and sideloading their malware, right? It's pretty interesting. So here's a security lock. Here's a lock on this ATM. It's super easy to bypass that little flippity bit there. And then this is me picking it. Yeah. It takes seconds, right? And then this is just the front cover of this ATM. Again, this is the wafer lock technology, right? Like if you're using real locks, it should be 20 minutes maybe, or 5 minutes. 3 minutes. So yeah, that was not good. So the story goes is that they actually had video of one attacker that came in. I think they were either taking a screwdriver and hitting that little release button on the top, or maybe even a screwdriver and jamming open the lock, which could be. But opening the computer compartment, they took the hard drive out and they left for 45 minutes. And then they came back and shoved the hard drive back in the machine, right? And at that point, that hard drive is now infected with some sort of malware. Then what would happen is they would go away, right? That's their disk mule. And then they would have a cache mule, right? This is somebody who would then show up. They had codes that would get texted to them. They were only valid for 24 hours. They'd go to the ATM, pull up a maintenance screen, and then enter in the codes, and the machine would dispense cache, right? And that's because they've loaded malware on the machine that hooks the DLL that dispenses the cache. It's pretty crazy stuff. So here's another one that I just did 2 weeks ago. This is kind of crazy. A little intro on this one. In this case, this is an ATM that previously I was like, these machines are good from a physical security perspective. However, this time the vendor decided to add electronic locks, which I can understand. Like it's good to have an audit trail, right? It's good to have some sort of privilege of or knowing what privilege a user has. Unfortunately, in this case, their electronic lock mechanisms allowed me to very quickly and easily bypass these super secure locks, right? So in this case, I've already inserted a shim, right? Just a long shim that becomes a bypass tool because they had a gate that was controlled by a solenoid. It's like, whoa. So that's the outside. That gets me access to the hard drive, gets me access to the computer, gets me access to the USB bus, the second network port, all that fun stuff. Once you're inside the ATM, the electronic control box was secured by 4 screws. And the power rail was also exposed. So I just had to figure out with a multimeter which of the wires was the one that controlled the solenoid inside that protected the cash vault, and essentially hotwire it. It's like, what? So I guess the way to prevent this stuff, like test your stuff as you deploy it, before you deploy it, once you deploy it. The bank in Mexico City, which had millions in cash taken from it, I can't say. So the bank had thousands of these ATMs deployed in production, right? So it's a big issue. So you have to make sure to test.
Was that the one where the ATMs in Yucatan were getting hit?
So the other thing you need to do is make sure you're locking down the application. Right? I think that's one of the things is that you need to run the apps as unprivileged users. You need to make sure there's some sort of privilege separation, and even run antivirus, right? I think one of the things that we're seeing is there's a tool that will, Solid Core is a tool that will say, oh, these are the only binaries that I can run. And one of them is PowerShell. How many people have owned a machine using PowerShell? Yeah, right? So we basically, we would take a PowerShell or take a interpreter payload, encode it in PowerShell, paste it into PowerShell at the console, and we'd have a remote shell back to where we were, right? So that is a viable attack from you've maybe paid off a maintenance person, or you've figured out how to open up the back of the door, right? And I think one of the other things is hold your vendors accountable. And they should be doing this testing. Like, why aren't they testing these things before they go out into the world? Why is it that we have to have a criminal ring identify this stuff for us before it happens? I should note the ATMs in Japan there wasn't a criminal ring against them. It was more due diligence testing, which is good, right? Tokyo is getting prepared for the Olympics, so I think there is some understanding that foreigners may not adhere to the same rules that Japanese culture does. All right, so what can you do personally, right? Make sure you review your bank statements. Ensure you have withdrawal limits on your card, right? Call your bank if you see unauthorized transactions. Your bank accounts are federally protected, which is really good, right? Whenever I go up to an ATM, I kind of pull out the shard. Like if I can pull it off or it feels loose, I'm not touching it. I'm walking away. Because there's a really good chance there's a card skimmer on it. Although from what I understand, the skimmers, people with card skimmers have gotten much better at putting covers on the ATMs now, to the point you can't even tell that it is a cover. But yeah, I think I have a couple minutes for questions here.
So we have a couple questions from the audience. They're wondering where you will upload the presentation at.
I can figure that out later. I don't know where. I can hand it off to BSides and they can post it.
Okay. And then Franco from the audience asked, do ATMs only use Windows or do some use some Linux variant? Is there a way to track the attackers?
So in this case, the cheapest and easiest route to market is Windows, unfortunately, right? All of these ATMs their core OS is Windows, which is kind of unfortunate. There's a little tear right here in my corner of my eye. I wish they would run Linux, because then we wouldn't have these problems.
And one more question is, what was the bit about vendor collusion? Was the vendor providing the limited time access code to the cache miles?
So there's a code, right, that some vendors can give to their maintenance people to gain access to the ATMs, right? That needs to also be provided to a user, right? Yeah, it's a very interesting bit, right?
Hi. What do you recommend as the best method for deriving the keys for full disk encryption, given that apparently the only ATM you mentioned that had any full disk encryption derived their keys in a way that was the same across devices?
So in this case, the software has the option to go online and pull down a unique key per machine. But because these ATMs were deployed into places where they can't trust the network, like literally a satellite feed that's maybe 64K, right? So they erred on the side of the machine actually being booted so that when the user comes to take out money, it works. Or the latency is the time that it takes to check the network and then dispense the cash, versus the machine just not working because it can't actually download its disk encryption key. And I totally understand what they're doing there, but unfortunately it's cost them a lot of money.
Okay. And to what extent are factory default passwords on cheaper minor ATMs in convenience stores still an issue, and to what extent are unpatched Windows XP ATMs deployed in the wild still an issue?
So I haven't personally done research on that, so I can't make comments on that.
All right, let's thank you, David, for coming to BSidesSF.
Thank you.